us more about the type of man he was, because I mean, it was quite unexpected that he would have studied literature. One would have thought, because of his political activism, he would have studied politics.
Yes, well, Chris Hani was an interesting figure, obviously, but we have to remember the context in which he was born. He was raised in the Eastern Cape, and a relatively very poor community, but he managed to go to a Catholic school and was quite brainy, and I think the influence of Catholicism became part of the influence that made him even the choices of what then he studies, and so many of those of that generation essentially. So politics is not something that they joined as a career. It's effectively, it was imposed on them, you know, and so the nature of the system of apartheid and the oppression that they experienced essentially thrust upon them to actually struggle against it. And so he just happened to be one of those that essentially rose to the fore. So within that context, and around that time, in the, I suppose, a number of these figures, you will see that others, they did law. It was mostly either law, and then it was mostly literature, humanities. But so that was the general trend of what was studied around that time.
Now, Sithembiso, talk to us about, you know, the University of Fort Hare and the influence that had on who he eventually became, especially with him being introduced and exposed to Marxism ideology there. How much of an influence did that have on him?
Well, University of Fort Hare is quite a significant institution, obviously. A number of what became leaders, not just in the country, I mean in the continent, essentially have roots in studying at Fort Hare. And so, and around that period, not only Comrade Chris Hani was produced there, but there's a number of, including, by the way, the late former president of Zimbabwe. Obviously, we also have the former leader of the IFP. So a number of these leading political figures were essentially produced, and within that generation, that expanded generation of students that came out of Fort Hare. And so it is a significant institution, and at that time it became significant in producing a lot of what became later leaders of liberation movements, but also leaders of new democracies and independent countries in the continent here.
And let's talk a little bit more about his involvement in the political space after, you know, graduating and, you know, moving into an active role as a politician, and what he stood for as he represented the people.
Yeah, so obviously he then, by the way, he studies at Fort Hare. By the way, he does not finish at Fort Hare.
Yeah.
And so he actually finishes his degree at UCT. But then, obviously, the time, then it just happens that his coming into himself coincides also with the depending of the liberation movements, the formation of the Mandela detachment, and the beginning of people going to exile. And so because then also of his commitment and his resolve on the significance of removing the apartheid system as the most direct route to actually build the kind of society that will honor human beings as human beings. And so then he found himself then in exile. And so in exile, but I think it is quite significant to trace his history. And so the influence of, is not just religion, but the influence of the Catholic upbringing. And so, because the life and the politics of Comrade Chris is very much tied to a deep consciousness, not just about the big concepts. In fact, in his last interview, that's one of the things that he mentions when there's an interview with Dr. Luli Kalinikos, in which he asserts that for him, socialism is not just big terminologies and big concepts, but it's about the basic things, making sure that there is no hunger, there is human settlements, that there is proper housing, there is proper health, you know. And so very much grounded in his consciousness, mostly framed around the respect for human dignity and for human life.
And how do we carry that ideology that lived within his consciousness forward in the country?
Well, obviously today, in memorizing or in commemorating the life and the legacy of Chris Hani, it definitely will mean that we have to remember, almost invoke within ourselves what is humanity. And so, just to make an example, so it's not just about the provision of services, but it's about the provision of services that bring human dignity. And so it's not just about people having houses. If that house is going to crack in 6 months, that does not bring human dignity. Take for instance, there was a recent case about, in the Eastern Cape, the teacher and the 11-year-old pupil, yes, and the pit latrines, you know. So while mainly the issue was about the teacher and the pupil, in remembering Chris Hani and maybe the spirit of Chris Hani, maybe then the bigger question should be, why is it that in 2021 a public institution still has a pit latrine? So linking that then to issues of human dignity, where does human dignity fit within the kinds of programs, within the kinds of activities that we are doing as human beings, but also our government, our institutions, including even the private sector, by the way, and so even the issue of exploitation of workers, bad working conditions, how do all of those fit within the notion of what Chris Hani represented, which was beyond just big words, big concepts, but really grounded and framed around the concept of human dignity and honoring a human life.
As you speak about human dignity and honoring a human life, of course, the principles of communism expand even beyond that, because you know, you look at South Africa today and you look at what's at stake, especially COVID-19 showing us the impact on our health systems and what that means for a human being and the manner in which they treat it. Now we're talking access to vaccines, who's in line and who will be prioritized. You mentioned education. We know that higher education was in turmoil, and it still is, with the students looking to get access, and a lot of them from you know, the missing middle and poor households relying on NSFAS. Those issues in mind, unemployment another one, gender-based violence. What do you think, or what do you imagine Chris Hani's take would be as a communist on those sort of issues?
We will probably, obviously, one of the significant things, obviously, about being a communist or socialist, obviously, is that it's a scientific theory that is governed very much by an analysis of actual concrete conditions, and so we can almost imagine, but we must always remember that Marxist theory is not cast in stone, so it's essentially dynamic and very much influenced by what's happening at the time. But we would imagine probably that Chris Hani, in the present, essentially will be in line with the people, with the formations, with the organizations that are pushing, for instance, on the issue of the national health insurance, to actually expedite, but the general improvement of the health services. Because when the national health insurance finally comes into effect, so the issue is not just about the NHI, it's essentially about the actual provision of quality health. And so Chris Hani will probably be within the forces that are pushing for the quality of health. I believe that Chris Hani will be also in support of the program around free higher education for the poor, and so making sure that, because part of our challenge is on the higher education issue, there is already some provision around NEFSAS and the free education for the poor. The challenge sometimes is the inefficiencies in the system. And so I do think that one of the key things probably that will be the contribution of the legacy of Chris Hani is how do we strengthen our institutions so that the institutions of the government that are supposed to provide services are actually properly functional. You know, and so because we hear a lot of challenges around amounts of figures that are missing within NEFSAS, this and that, people being suspended, all those kind of things. And so part of the challenge, it's not necessarily that the provisions have not been there, but part of the challenge is that the corruption has essentially eroded institutionalism and the ability of actual institutions to actually do what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, I'd like for us to continue our discussion, especially touching on corruption. Joined in studio by Chris Hani Institute Director, Dr. Sithembiso Bhengu, talking about Chris Hani's legacy and the impact of the man that he was as we commemorate the 28 years since his passing. That conversation also lined up and coming up shortly after this. Stay tuned.
And it's the breaking news story coming out dawn past this hour. Political activist and freedom fighter Chris Hani has been shot and killed. And it's the breaking news story coming out dawn past this hour. Political activist and freedom fighter Chris Hani has been shot and killed.
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us on the AM edition of Newsfeed. Now, as we remember Chris Hani and reflect on the man that he was, his ideologies and legacy, we're still joined in studio by the director of the Chris Hani Institute, Dr. Sithembiso Bhengu. Dr. Bhengu, before we went on the break, you were speaking about the impact of corruption on structures and systems in South Africa. And of course, it leads to questions on Chris Hani's stance on blatant corruption, on austerity and neoliberalism as some of the factors that stand out when we speak about Chris Hani's views.
Yes, in fact, I do remember very well his last interview. In fact, there's a clip that you can find even on YouTube, in which Chris Hani alludes that the biggest challenge that is going to face South Africa and the movement after the dawn of democracy was actually an economic one. And he then argues that, because it's important to note that, by the way, South Africa, we are one of the last countries to essentially gain political freedom, following many other countries that had similar national liberation struggles led by national liberation movements. And so he was a student of these, and so he studied these, and he highlights what has happened in many of these countries. And he argues that his biggest concern and his biggest worry and warning was that there will be a development of a political elite. There will be the case of corruption of individual selfish interests trumping over essentially the actual communal country interest. He even mentioned that, in fact, in that interview, he even mentions about the issue of people going into the state and then mentioned that driving Mercedes-Benz, you know, and so, but as an analog, the issue that he was concerned about was the tendency of incumbency and the kinds of corroding measures that normally comes, in which then those that are ascending into state power and into institutions, they then actually develop new class interests, and they begin to do things that are not necessarily for the benefit of everyone. And so, and in that interview, he actually does mention that the possibility of corruption as a real challenge to actually advancing the transformation of a society that will benefit all.
Let's quickly talk to the 10th of April 1993, that fateful day, and the subsequent events after that, with him being assassinated by Janusz Waluś.
Yes, so obviously what then we officially know is that Comrade Chris, coming back from a jog in his house, and out of nowhere he is obviously confronted by the gunman and he is shot. By the way, he is shot and then he's shot again once he's on the floor. One of the significant things, by the way, is that the killer is actually recognized by one of the neighbors, which is why essentially Janusz Waluś was arrested, because one of the neighbors is the one that actually gave features of what the person looked like. And so then they was able to have a close down within a particular area that led to his arrest, and so I think those are quite significant, especially because Comrade Chris was now living in Boksburg, of which we at that time was quite a predominantly white and Afrikaner suburb, and so the aim of the killer and the people that conspired with him to essentially assassinate Comrade Chris and would later emerge that this was a right-wing force or right-wing formation. So it's an interesting issue that it was actually an African